Good afternoon to everyone, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today on depression and suicide. My name is Dale Gasparovic. I am the administrator for the Student Assistance Center at Prevention First. Before we get started with our content today, I wanted to make you all aware of a couple of trainings that we'll be doing through the Student Assistance Center, our two-day Student Assistance Development trainings coming up. Of course, there will be more added as time goes along, but I wanted to make you aware of three of them that are upcoming. One, February 8th and 15th at Chestnut Health Systems in Belleville, Illinois. One in Springfield, Illinois on April 4th and 5th at Prevention First in Springfield. And then on April 16th and 17th in Quincy, Illinois, we'll be doing a two-day SAP development training at the Adams County Health Department those days. Without further ado, I want to welcome everyone and especially welcome our presenter today, Don Mitkus, and he will take us through the rest of our presentation today. Don, I'm going to send you the control of the presentation now.
Thanks, Dale. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Don Mitkus. Let me get this going there. Okay. I'm a consultant with Prevention First with the Student Assistance Center. Full-time, I work for Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health Hospital, and I've been involved with student assistance for about 20 years now. One of the real keys of student assistance is having an understanding of the issues that your team will be faced with as you're intervening with students. Certainly, one of the biggest issues, aside from substance abuse or violence, is depression. Depression is a very common issue that that adolescents face, and that depression can exacerbate to the point where thoughts of suicide can become an issue. So we're going to talk about that today. So one of the things that I hope that you take away from today's presentation, includes seeing what the symptoms of depression are. In order to be able to intervene, you need to be able to identify. So knowing what depression looks like in teenagers is important. It can look different than it does with adults. So understanding that suicide is a big picture issue. Suicide happens in amongst adolescents, amongst adults, but when it happens with an adolescent in a school setting, there are specific challenges that you as a staff may face, and we're going to talk about that. So identify the protective factors in regards to suicide, identify those factors that are indicative that someone is at risk for attempting or completing a suicide. Know when you need to act, when those warning signs come up, which are the ones that need immediate attention, hence the red light warning signs. There are some signs that are less immediate and less crisis oriented that still need attention, but there are some that you need to act on fairly quickly. Get a level of comfort offering some things that you can say if you are dealing with someone who is at risk for suicide, and knowing, having some ideas of what to do as a community in the event that there is a suicide amongst your student population. What we call postvention, what happens after the fact, because there are some things that it's a suicide of a student can have some pretty significant ripple effects that need to be addressed. So some things that we're going to be talking about, just to define some terms we'll be talking about today. Suicide. It's fairly clear. It's intentionally taking one's own life. An suicidal act or gesture is where someone will harm oneself without it resulting in death. Suicide behavior, again, thoughts, plans, or actions, which, if implemented, could result in death. So, and these are some of the red light warning signs we'll talk about. So, when there's a big three when it comes to suicide that we'll talk about, but thoughts and plans, or making attempts are things that need to be attended to. And postvention. So, how do you intervene after suicide with students and faculty and family and friends, those that are impacted by the suicide? One thing I do want to let you know is that there will be time for questions, so please feel free if you do have a question to type it in, and Dale will interrupt and we'll address it as best we can on the fly, and we will take a little time at the end to answer questions as well. So, teen depression. Adults, when they experience sadness, may very well have a little bit better insight than adolescents do. Adolescents suffer from what I call the three I's. They're invulnerable, they're immortal, and they're infertile. Their depression may start with an adolescent, and they may not even be aware that they're suffering from a depressive state that needs help or needs treatment. When a teen suffers from depression, some things that they exhibit, their rejection, failure. Depression can come from feelings of guilt or low self-esteem. And low self-esteem can come from many sources. Again, school failures. It can result in poor relationships. It can result in a chaotic home situation. Oftentimes, they'll develop what are called somatic symptoms. They'll be at the nurse's or your equivalent of a nurse's office, dean's office, with complaints of physical illnesses that have no basis in another illness. So it could be, often they talk of stomach aches or headaches. They could be frequently absent from school. Depression, and we'll talk a little bit about anxiety, but both of these conditions can keep a student from having the motivation to attend school, to make that extra effort. With the students that you may be dealing with, many of them, this is their last chance to be able to succeed in the school environment, and if they're suffering from depression, that extra motivation that they may need to push through or to make it to school, that energy just might not be available to them. Sometimes with adolescent depression, there's an irritability. They may make threats or attempt to run away from home, escape how they're feeling inside by escaping where they're currently living. Some other things you might see include changes in eating or sleeping patterns. They might not have an appetite. They might not be pushing their food around on their plate. Depression is often mistakenly thought of as disrupting sleep in a way that people sleep a lot or spend a lot of time in bed. But the reality is depression often causes a disturbance in sleep where it's difficult to fall asleep or stay asleep. There's frequent awakenings during the night. And that sleep deprivation, that lack of REM sleep, contributes to the ongoing symptoms of depression. Good sleep is required to replenish those neurotransmitters in our brain that regulate our mood. And if you're not getting 3 to 4 cycles of REM sleep a night, that can deplete it even further and worsen the symptoms and feelings of depression. They may be sad or blue. There's often people note a change in behavior or investment in things that they used to like doing. They may have been involved in a sport or an activity that they say they just no longer enjoy. It's a condition we call anhedonia. There's no lust for life. There's no enjoyment out of things that are normally enjoyable for them. Their energy is low. They'll have trouble concentrating. These are it's not uncommon for some signs of depression to be mistaken for attentional issues. Their teachers may become frustrated with their daydreaming, or they're not attending in class, or their inability to focus on a task. And that could be because of depression. They can become socially withdrawn. They can stop hanging around with friends, or separating themselves from groups. The feelings of depression often lead someone to become isolative. So someone who's normally social or outgoing can become something of a loner. One of the signs that that you can look for is friends who are expressing concern that they're not seeing someone as frequently, or why aren't you coming to hang out? You may hear these conversations in the hallways. That can be a sign that someone is suffering from depression. And again, someone can be suicidal. Depression can lead someone to experience thoughts and feelings of hopelessness or helplessness, the inability to see options for how to change their circumstance or control these dark feelings. And their depressive symptoms can take them down some dark roads, including thoughts of harming or harming themselves or ending their life because they see little else that they could do to end this state of emotional pain. Anxiety and depression are fairly closely related, but there's the thing about anxiety is that anxiety is, as painful as depression can be, anxiety is extraordinarily uncomfortable, and normally easier to get someone to agree to get some help. Depression saps energy and takes it away. Anxiety agitates someone pretty significantly, and it might be easy, and it's usually easier to get someone who's anxious to engage in getting some help or treatment. A student that's anxious, just to kind of differentiate between anxiety and depression. A student who excessively worries, might be overly obsessive about any particular thing. It could be about neatness. It could be about performing particular rituals in order to help them feel less anxious. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. They might have difficulty making friends or maintaining relationships because of excessive worry that they then will bring into the relations with other friends that makes other adolescents feel uncomfortable. The anxiety can lead them to be isolative or perfectionistic. Their thinking can become pretty rigid. Again, that's more OCD-like. Or they might, those that with an anxiety disorder, that includes phobias, so irrational fears of a particular thing happening or whether or not they have control over it coming to pass. One of the things that we see most frequently with students with anxiety disorders in regards to school is school refusal, that there's some fear or anxiety that's keeping them from coming to school. And that could be a fear of what would happen when they came to school. It could be a fear of failure. It could be a fear of safety, feeling safe in the school environment. It could be that they're being socially judged. These are all anxieties that can grow to the point that a student will refuse to come to school. Anxiety does not often lead to thoughts of suicide. However, anxiety and depression together, and they can go together, can be a very difficult combination to deal with for an adolescent, and does more frequently see suicidal thoughts and ideations. So, in regards to suicide, because this is clearly when a student is suffering from depression, the worst case scenario is that they're having thoughts of wanting to harm themselves, and it's a wider spread issue than many people are willing to talk about. Adolescence is a turbulent time, and depression is more common than most people do think. So, in a study that was completed, just for an example, as you can see, 2/3 students of youths who had completed a suicide had made a suicidal statement before they completed the suicide. Almost half had drank within 12 hours of killing themselves. And 3/4 had declined in their academic performance in the year prior to their act of killing themselves. So this is an issue that is preventable. These are preventable deaths if the people around the students are able to recognize that that someone is at risk and needs intervention. The second point, with almost half drinking within 12 hours prior to killing themselves, brings to light the fact that substance abuse can be a very significant contributor to a student suicide, and is found in adult suicide as well. Approximately half of completed suicides amongst adults occur when the person is under the influence of alcohol or another substance. So fortunately, the attempts that are made are not always potentially lethal. So there's a number of attempts or trial runs before compared to the number of completions. So when a teen attempts, typically there are some trial runs, some attempts before suicide is completed, and girls attempt more frequently. However, boys use methods that are typically more potentially fatal. So boys are more likely to use a gun or or hanging as a means of committing suicide, where girls more frequently will attempt to cut themselves or overdose on pills or medications in order to complete suicide, which you have a little bit more time to intervene with after those sorts of attempts, as opposed to hanging or the use of a firearm. So every year, again, approximately 2,000 teen suicides. And from the previous slide, you can see that at least half of them have, half to 3/4 have signs that could make these numbers be cut in half. So, as you can see, this suicide is a pardon me. Suicide is a greater risk for adolescents than it is for other age groups. Third leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds. Behind motor vehicle accidents, which is the number one. So there's the risk is fairly high as a potential risk for adolescents. So we talked a little bit about alcohol. The rate of those with alcohol dependence is suicide rate is about 50 times higher than the general population. Regular alcohol use, and alcohol dependence happens in about 10% of the population. Put someone at some very serious risk for suicide, because they're, of course, when you're under the influence of alcohol, your good reasoning is severely impaired. It's within a couple of drinks. The first thing to become impaired is your prefrontal cortex, or your reasoning centers.
And Don,
which is the part of your brain that generally would tell you that it's not a good idea to attempt suicide, and there are other options. So of all suicides, alcohol-dependent persons make up about 25%. And alcohol dependence means someone who is drinking continuously, despite the easiest way to put it is they continue to drink or use other drugs despite mounting consequences. There's multiple consequences that's impacting their ability to function in their major life role, is school, work. It's impairing their relationships. They're getting into trouble with the authorities. And despite those very clear signs that their alcohol use is causing them significant problems, they continue to do so.
Hey, Don.
They can also exhibit tolerance, and when they stop drinking or using, they tend to have some sort of withdrawal. So
Don?
approximately 1 out of 5 alcoholics eventually commit suicide. In the states, as you can see, where alcohol is most restricted, they have the lowest suicide rate. So the number is fairly, the fact that government policy can have an impact on this is fairly clear. Where it's restricted, there's fewer people drinking, less access, therefore less contributory risk to suicide.
Hey, Don,
Yes.
you mentioned in the last slide about suicide being the 11th leading cause of death, and you said it was behind motor vehicle accidents. Is there any indication of what percentage of those motor vehicle accidents are actually one-car accidents that were possibly suicides that weren't classified as such?
There's the numbers of identified suicides are probably higher. I don't have specific numbers on that, but there's certainly there's the possibility that there are suicides that are completed that are not classified as suicides for multiple reasons. Unclear motor vehicle accidents could certainly be part of it. But I've not seen any research on that specifically.
Yeah, I've seen some anecdotal discussion of especially adolescent motor vehicle crashes, especially when they're one-car crashes,
Right.
that are linked to some depressive symptoms in the victim of those crashes. So I was curious if you had any research on that.
I don't, but there's some sense to it in the fact that driving while impaired certainly is one of the reasons why motor vehicle accidents claim the most adolescent lives. And if you're depressed, not concentrating, not attending to what's going on around you, and you're in a car, you're much certainly at higher risk for to put yourself in a situation where you can get in an accident. Mm-hmm. So at the very least, the mood, the mental state of the individual who's depressed doesn't lend itself towards good driving behaviors.
Thank you.
Sure. So something that, and I've had discussions with some of you folks, some of the schools that I work with, about self-injury. Self-injury is not typically suicidal in nature. Self-injury, it's an attempt, it's a way to cope. Whereas suicide is someone is not seeing options and is wanting to end their life, to end their pain. Someone who self-injures is attempting to cope with their pain in a very maladaptive way. Typically, there's two motivations to self-injure. One is to feel something because they feel very emotionally numb or disconnected, and the self-injury provides them with a feeling, or they are trying to distract themselves from some internal pain, some other emotional pain, and the self-injury allows them to distract away from that emotional state of pain that they're in. In both cases, the goal of the behavior is not to die. The goal of the behavior is actually to live and to cope. As maladaptive and as destructive as it is, it's not suicidal in nature. Therefore, that's why professionals have coined the term non-suicidal self-injury, or NSSI. But self-injury can take many forms, aside from cutting or making lacerations. It could be burning, it could be picking, it could be scratching, pulling out hair. One of the more recent trends, a couple of recent trends we've been seeing include embedding, where they'll take a foreign object, could be a pin, a needle, or a piece of metal that they'll embed under their skin, and then they can tap or rub that area to get the same sensation as when they self-injured without more self-injury. And something that just came to light today, something to be on the lookout for. There's I know it sounds silly, but Justin Bieber was I guess there was a picture of him using marijuana. So there's been a movement out in the Twitter sphere of fans who are protesting his use and trying to get him stopped by self-injuring themselves. It's hashtag cuts for Bieber. Not quite sure how that's going to impact his behavior, but just something to be aware of if you happen to have any Justin Bieber fans in your student body. Anyways, so again, self-injury is not necessarily suicide. Now, someone can self-injure to the point where they can put themselves at physical risk or risk to end their life, but the intention is not to end their life. Their intention is to cope with what's going on and to live. So both need treatment, both need help. Self-injury is a very maladaptive coping skill that needs attention, but the intention for those two things are different. So here's some protective factors, some things that are protective against someone having the opportunity or getting to the point of wanting to commit suicide. So when someone is experiencing problems with a disorder, whether that's mental or physical, whether they're using a chemical, getting help and getting help early, and that's where SAP really can come in and shine. Getting help is as early as it's identified, can prevent someone from getting to that mental place where they're thinking of ending their own life. If they're in their home or in their environment, not having access to highly lethal means of ending one's life, if they get to a point with their depression where they're having thoughts of suicide and they have easy access to a method that's highly lethal, like a gun, like a large amount of medication, there are chances that their attempt, because when someone is depressed, they're, again, low energy, and they're going to look for convenient means to end their pain. If that convenient mean is a gun, their chance of a fatal attempt is much higher. Having a relationship with an adult that is meaningful, that is that student that is connected with a caring adult, is helpful in a couple of ways. One is it gives them a lifeline. If they're feeling down, depressed, and they have an established relationship with a helping professional, it could be a church member, it could be a counselor at school, it could be a counselor outside of school, it could be a teacher. It could be a member of the student assistance team, someone that they've developed a relationship with, that when they're feeling particularly low or helpless, that they are more likely to reach out to, who can then, more importantly, get them connected with help. So having that relationship is helpful for when they're low. The other factor that having an established relationship with a caring adult is it's students, adolescents that have that sort of relationship with a caring adult are less likely to suffer from depression. Those that are isolated, those that do not have a positive relationship with caring adults, whether that's a parent or another member of the community, feel disconnected and isolated, which can lead to depression, which leads to the next point again, connectedness, being connected to a community, whether that's the school community, their community that they live in, having friends, having family, reduces that potential sense of isolation that those that suffer from depression feel. When you feel isolated and depressed, your thoughts can become more distorted and irrational, because you don't have people who are noticing these changes because you're not connected. People who could say, hey, what's going on with you? And again, this is where the SAP team can come in, is for those kids that aren't necessarily connected, that don't necessarily have those resources. You can be that group of people to say, hey, we've noticed something's going on. how can we help you? Because for many kids that suffer depression, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for someone who cares to notice. Students that have, adolescents that have learned problem-solving skills, ways to deal with conflict without resorting to violence. If you have little ability to solve problems in your own life, the chances of depression developing become higher. Your ability to see other solutions for how you're feeling or what your situation, those environmental factors that are driving the depression, if you can't problem solve, you might have a harder time seeing a way out, so to speak. And again, that feeling connectedness, if you're belong to a culture or belong to a faith group that discourages suicide, that embraces life, as most do, it can be very helpful to have that connectedness to a higher power, so to speak, something that cares. So here are some things to consider as kind of lower level risk factors when it comes to suicide that need attention but aren't yet at the necessarily critical stage. When you're intervening with a student who has a diagnosed mental disorder, such as already has a diagnosed depression or anxiety disorder, eating disorder, the suicide rate amongst those with eating disorders is particularly high. Eating disorders has the highest mortality rate of any of the mental disorders by a percentage basis. So approximately 1 out of 10 people who suffer from an eating disorder will die from it, whether that's from malnutrition or whether that's from suicidal depression resultant of their eating disorder. Those that are abusing substances, as we talked about before, are at a higher risk for attempting suicide. If there's a family history, which is why it's important when you're intervening with someone to be able to gather some family history of psychiatric disorders, a family history of suicide, in particular if there's an immediate family member that committed suicide. It puts that person at a higher risk for developing those thoughts, feelings, and exhibiting those behaviors. Feelings of hopelessness, impulsive, aggressive. It's very easy for those impulsive or aggressive students to turn those behaviors and those thoughts inward. Anger and depression are often viewed as two sides of the same coin. Anger is directed outward. Depression is anger directed inward. Another risk factor is poor access to mental health treatment, which is again is where the SAP team comes in, is developing those bridges with providers in your community that can intervene with the student as soon as the need is identified. If they have to wait 6 or 8 weeks to see a psychiatrist, or wait 3 or 4 weeks to see a counselor, and that's putting them in a situation that is much higher risk than if they had more immediate access. And as we talked about, another risk factor is a chaotic home life, chaotic home situation. Parents are divorced, especially if they're divorced and not co-parenting, even though they're divorced, or there's a chaotic home situation, or there's little connection between the adolescent and their parents. Worse yet is if there's an abusive situation at home, either emotional or physical. There is it's certainly a higher risk factor for potential suicidal ideation. Losses, as we know with the Fiscally speaking, we're going through a very difficult time as a society, and those losses, parent losing a job, financial stressors at home, relationship losses, loss of girlfriend, boyfriend, can all be contributing factors to depression and or suicidal ideation. If they suffer from a protracted physical illness that also is sapping their strength and their motivation, and kind of assaulting their fortitude, it can make depression is, if not looked out for, can easily settle in. If they've had a previous suicide attempt, that puts them at high risk to attempt again. We talked about access to lethal methods, lack of connectedness to other people their age, peers, if they lack friends, if they lack connection to a culture, community. And this is where we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when if suicide comes home to your school. Exposure to media reports of suicide, especially if it's somewhat glamorous, as sometimes the media can sensationalize a suicide. For those that are suffering from depression and are feeling hopeless, seeing these sorts of things can make it seem like an attractive option for them when they're not seeing very many other options. Okay, so when do you get help? When do you as a team say, we really need to do something and do something immediately? If the adolescent is talking or writing about suicide or death, that's a pretty clear indicator that it's heavily weighing on their minds, especially if they're writing things that are being handed in a report, in an essay. It's pretty risk-taking in a sense for them to write those things down to be read by another person. When they're not only feeling hopeless, but they're feeling helpless. Hopeless not being able to see many options for the future, but also helpless that they have no ability to do anything about it. The two in combination are pretty strong indicators that that adolescent is at risk. Coming out and making statements about wanting to die, about killing themselves, not wishing they didn't exist, are all pretty serious statements, especially if said in a school setting. If they start giving things away, if they start calling people that they hadn't been in contact with, or saying goodbye to people, they're giving away their possessions. Those are all indicators that that someone is putting their, quote, affairs in order, end quote. If they're engaging in more reckless behaviors, reckless behind the wheel, putting themselves in risky or dangerous situations, if they're running away from home, these are all indicators that someone needs some pretty immediate attention and help. If they, after a period where there's been a noticeable change in their behavior or mood, and they've been obviously depressed, and if they have a very sudden change to looking happy or content, or that they're all of a sudden their mood is very bright in comparison to where they had been, that's also another sign that help should be eminently provided, because that person might have made a decision. They may have decided that they found a way out. They found a way to end their suffering, and that brings them something of a sense of peace, that they're thinking of following through with their plan to end their life. So some things they might be saying if they're typically if they're hopeless: there's no point going on, I can't take it anymore, nothing to live for, I can't stop the pain, I can't live without blank, girlfriend, boyfriend, things get worse and worse, I might as well kill myself. Again, these are things that, if said, should not be blown off. It should be taken seriously and be taken at face value. Although these feelings may be transitory, and we know as adults we go through these times that can be dark, but we come through it, doesn't necessarily help that student in that moment, because that feeling of hopelessness can drive them to act irrationally. Why do we need to be involved? School has more contact than pretty much any other factor in an adolescent's life. We have them for 6 to 8 hours a day, typically. And we see them fairly closely during that time. At home, they can hide. We don't allow them to hide in school. They have to be in class. They have to be attending. They are called upon. They're seen by their peers. At home, they can potentially shut themselves away. They can make themselves unavailable, either physically or emotionally. And because we are asking them to complete tasks, we're asking them to complete assignments, we're asking them to perform in school, it becomes much more apparent in a school setting than at home that someone is suffering from depressive symptoms, because we see that their lack of energy is resulting in a lack of efforts or lower efforts or inattentiveness as we're asking them to perform these tasks. And if they're again, we talked about one of the contributing factors to depression is a dysfunctional family system, then at home, if the family's dysfunctional, the likelihood of them being able to help out one of their members that's in distress is less likely. So things to be aware of. Dramatic changes, sudden changes, changes within a couple-week period should all be attended to as potential signs of depression. So declining grades, decrease in effort, misconduct, increase in absences. Who should intervene? Well, it's pretty clear. Especially in this SAP team, know what your limitations are. Know what you guys are able to do as a team. If you're unclear whether or not you're the right person, then certainly seek out some guidance from those who might know a little bit more about intervening with depression and suicide in your building. If you don't have someone like that in your building, then having a resource in the community that you can reach out to is important. Having those bridges to resources to get that kid help. So if you know that if you're someone that's a recent survivor of suicide, had someone in your life that's taken their own life, experiencing depression yourself, significantly stressed in your own life, if you don't have a good relationship with that teenager, get someone else to intervene. You should not be the person to be intervening with that kid, both for that kid's sake and yours. What do you need to know? There's no confidentiality when a kid is talking about suicide. FERPA doesn't apply. Mental health confidentiality doesn't apply. You have a duty to act and disseminate information in a way that will preserve life. So if someone is saying that they're suicidal and they say, don't tell the parents, don't tell my parents, don't do this, you can't keep that secret. You've got to get that kid some help, unless by disclosing to a particular person you would make the situation worse, like if there's an abusive parent. Act immediately. Don't wait until the end of the day. Don't wait. If a student is suicidal, don't let them out of your sight. Have someone with them all the time until you can hand them off to someone that can help them. And even if you're not sure, if it seems ambiguous, err on the side of caution. Better that someone is inconvenienced than something tragic happen. So something to keep in mind as if you're considering putting something curriculum about suicide prevention, teaching a course on it is not helpful. Research does not support it. If speaking specifically on suicide, teaching those things that are protective factors against depression and suicide, problem-solving, social skills, conflict resolution, etc., that is helpful in preventing suicide in teens. Talking specifically about suicide is not helpful. Don't sensationalize or normalize suicide. Teach facts, warning signs, risk factors, but don't impart knowledge. Don't talk about how people commit suicide, but talking about the warning signs that someone might be in trouble. How do you help a friend if they're depressed, talking about hurting themselves? Those are the sorts of things that are good for teachers and students to know. And it should be taught in a broader mental health focus. So again, talking more about enhancing coping skills, dealing with risk factor issues like substance abuse, is going to be more productive in preventing suicide and reducing potential depression than talking about suicide specifically.
And Don, I would add to that one of the things we know is the best way to help a student to deal with their own depression and suicidal ideation is to teach that student to get help for a friend.
Yes. It's less threatening when you talk about it in terms of this is how you can help out a friend that you might be concerned about, rather than saying if you need help, because adolescents don't think they need help. But if you talk about it in terms of these are some important things to know to help out a friend, they're more likely to listen and internalize those skills. So things you can take, what actions you can take immediately if school counselor, social worker are typically trained in handling these sorts of crises in the absence of a counselor or social worker, certainly a school administrator. If you don't have a plan in place with how to deal with a student that's suicidal, you need to have one. And that's something that the SAP team can take the lead in. And the school is developing a crisis plan for how to help a student that's in that sort of immediate crisis. Again, keeping that student under supervision at all times until they can be handed off to someone that can help them out is crucial. Don't let them out of your sight. So what can you say? Here are some examples. I'm going to stay with you. I'm glad you told me. We're going to help. We're going to get you connected to something that's going to help you. Being encouraging in the fact that they decided to share those feelings with you is good. Don't tell them everything's going to be all right, or it's just a phase. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It'll get better, because they can't see that. When you're feeling hopeless and helpless, you don't see how it can be better. So encourage the behavior of them sharing the feelings, and that help is available, and you're going to get them connected to it. Don't dismiss their feelings, because most likely you've had other adults dismiss their feelings of depression and suicide, and it just encourages them not to say anything. Don't let them bargain you out of getting help. If you're starting the process of getting them connected with health, whether that's connecting with a counselor or social worker, getting connected with a hospital, because the risk does appear to be pretty imminent, often that process can snap a student out of that state momentarily, where they start to backpedal and say, hey, I'm really okay. I'm not feeling like that anymore. Don't continue the process. Take it to its end, because you can't take the risk that they fear that their plan is going to be foiled, and they're pulling it together just so they can make an attempt later on. Safety contracts are useless, honestly, from both a clinical and a liability perspective. Saying, okay, if you agree, we're going to meet tomorrow, and if you agree to meet with me every day from now on, you can go home. We won't follow through with getting connected with help. It's all you're doing is providing them with an opportunity to continue their thoughts and planning. And don't threaten. Because it's students, adolescents, it becomes a power struggle in a sense. And you don't want to coerce them into getting help. You want them to realize that you want to engage them that getting the help is what's going to be best for them, not that they're being punished by being sent to the hospital or sent to the emergency room. So in the worst case scenario, if there is suicide that occurs amongst your students, it's important that you attend to that as a school community. Suicides can have something of contagion effect. In the district we work with up in Barrington, very affluent community, we had 8 suicides within a 12-month period. Started with one and just snowballed. Because again, those that are already suffering from depression, if one person ends their life, it then becomes a more attractive option to those that are dealing with those thoughts and feelings themselves. It may put them in a state that they will attempt themselves. So so identifying those students that are at risk after a suicide, so those students that are close to the student that committed suicide are at particular risk and need to, the school needs to have a plan to intervene with those kids, meeting with them one-on-one, having counselors, having agencies from the community who are trained in responding to these sorts of crises to come in and do some debriefing with those students can be helpful in helping them begin a healthy grieving process. Talking to them about its normal feelings such as anger or guilt or sadness, and that there's not a right way to grieve or how to feel about this, and to let them know that if they're concerned about themselves or another friend, that there are resources available for them to get help or to kind of process the feelings that they're experiencing. Make sure the information you give is accurate. Dispel rumors, because these incidents like this can tend to develop into mythical or legendary sorts of stories. So stick with facts, stick with basics, don't sensationalize, but give accurate information and correct rumors. Talk about how there's no one in particular, there's no one to blame. Focus on the survivors, and there's all other ways for dealing with problems. And then the team that's, again, if you don't have a process in place, a crisis team to dealing with any type of crisis, and student suicide is certainly one of them. If you don't have that sort of crisis plan or crisis team identified in place, the SAP can fill that role. But having an idea of how you would approach those crises, and there's plenty of schools that have developed crisis plans where you don't have to reinvent the wheel, can be helpful in knowing how you're going to respond to these sorts of crises. I worked for a school where there was a suicide over the summer, and it became apparent we didn't have an adequate plan because there was only one representative of the school that attended the funeral, which is unconscionable as a school. I didn't find out until 2 weeks after it happened because it was during the summer. So it's important to have a plan on how you're going to disseminate information to those that need to know and can respond to the crisis. Let's see. So again, emphasizing that help's available. Make sure students know where they can go to get help if they're seeking it while at school or outside of school, who they can call or contact, what agencies, what resources are available to them. What not to do. Don't put up a memorial. Don't plant a tree. Don't put up a plaque or a statue or whatever, because it winds up glorifying or sentimentalizing the suicide, which becomes, again, a potential risk factor for those that are depressed and potentially suicidal themselves. Things you can let the parents know, information that should be disseminated to parents in the event of a suicide at school, that if they're concerned about their student, that there's help available where they can get help, how they can, they should elicit, how they can best support their child, where they can become informed, where how they should restrict access to any potentially lethal methods of suicide in their own home, and if they're concerned about their child following a suicide at school. Steps teens can take in letting them know that they should take their friends' actions and statements seriously, be a good friend, encourage them to get help. If they don't want to get help, talk to a trusted adult. And don't keep a secret, even if they tell you that they will never be your friend again if you tell anyone about how they're feeling. So, with just a few minutes left, looks like we got about 4 minutes. Want to give some time for if you had any questions.
Any questions for Don at all?
All right.
All right. We will be sending out the slides. I'll be sending the slides out to everyone who registered. There is a question here. Hang on just a second, Don. It says, how do you handle parents who want to make memorials?
You can explain to them how it's not. They can make memorials that they share with their own family and friends, but not at the school. The school's a public place, and it puts those that are. You let them know that becomes a potential risk factor for those that are contemplating that option themselves. If they want to make their own memorials for their own family outside of the school, that's their prerogative. But as a school, it's not advisable that you do one there. Holding rallies or big grief sessions in the gym or having whole bunches of people come together is typically not helpful and typically just sensationalizes the act, which is not what you want to do. And if you do have questions after this, or after you have a chance to kind of look through the slides, if you have questions that come up later, my contact information is on the last slide. If you do, feel free to contact me via email. That's my cell phone number. Pretty readily available. Be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any other questions? Feel free to contact Don or myself. I'd be happy to answer those. Also, I want to thank you all for attending today, and I hope this webinar was helpful to all of you in your work with your SAPs and otherwise. If there's any other questions, like I said, feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to answer those questions for you. Look forward to having some of you join us at future webinars. The next one coming up is in February, and we'll be talking about pressures, sexual pressures, and in particular in that we'll be talking about some of the social media pressures to engage in sexual behavior for teenagers. And so we look forward to continuing to present these webinars for all of you in the future. Thank you, everyone, for attending.